writer to reader. And then we also discussed Michel Foucault's idea of what is an author. So do you remember anything from what is an author?
So we discussed that we also discussed something called the author function, and also how there is a change in the meaning of the author in different contexts and in different historical times.
Right. So what are the implications of this observation?
Sorry, sir.
What will be the implications of this observation that what we mean by author changes according to the domain of discourse, like scientific or literary or what, and it changes according to history, it changes according to cultural context. For example, for us Indians, if you look at it, then Mahabharata is written by Ved Vyas, but Ved Vyas is a kind of divine character in the poem itself. So, and if you ask somebody who speaks in Gita, Bhagavad Gita, for example, then Bhagavad Gita is spoken by Krishna, but that is reported to us and Dhritarashtra by Sanjay, and that is reported to us by Ved Vyas, and that is reported to us by Janmajaya, and in the Sarpasatra sacrifice from which the Mahabharata begins. So we are not really sure which is the source of the voice, and there are multiplicity of voices, and which one of them is true voice remains a question, right? So authorship is not a natural, given, simple phenomena or an idea, but a complex historical one, right? That is something that we discussed and that is what Catherine Belsey points out when she is talking of multiplicity of voices in Milton's poems very often. Yeah. And what else do you remember?
If we talk about these implications, you gave us an example of madness, like from 17th century, madness becomes a subject of research.
Who discusses that? Who has theorized about this?
Sir, Michel, Carl Jung. No, sir. This Michel Foucault only.
Right.
And he says that there is no universal meaning of madness.
Correct. So, and what else does he say?
And sir, he says that madness has spatial and cultural specific.
Right. Which means it's basically a historical phenomena, right?
Yes, sir.
So madness in Europe is not the same as madness in India, for example, or madness in 15th century is not the same as madness in 21st century. So how madness is understood has changed over a period of time. And he talks about 17th, 18th century onwards, with the rise of industrial revolution, the industrial middle class, right, which was secular and rationalist in its outlook, saw madness as a kind of a disease, a pathological phenomena, which has to be studied scientifically, right? So it becomes an object of research. And behind this whole desire to, and the narrative that was given was this scientific treatment of madness was more humane, more liberating, more precise way to deal with madness. While in fact it seems to be correlated with the rise of industrialized capitalist middle class, who gives priority to sanity as labor in wealth production. And because mad people are incapable of producing labor and wealth, they were segregated, excluded from the normal society, right? And the whole mechanism of research became a kind of political apparatus which studies in order to control something. So Foucault is also drawing upon ideas of Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, who says that knowledge is actually expression of will to power rather than rationality. Desire for knowledge comes from will to power, which is irrational, which lies beyond our rationality. And this will to power, Nietzsche points out, is something that drives human society instead of rationality. So Nietzsche is attacking something called Enlightenment philosophy and Christianity. And he is attacking modernity, which is based on the idea of rationality, humanism, progress. These are some of the key ideas of modernity, which Nietzsche is attacking, right? And Foucault draws upon Nietzsche to point out that the whole apparatus of knowledge production that came into being in 18th century to study madness was in fact correlated to the capitalist industrialist society that was coming up on one hand, and secondly it was also trying to other madness, right? And in order to kind of control, have power over madness, right? So that was the politics of disciplinary formations like pathology or psychology or psychiatry and so on and so forth, right? It became an object of research. So he is pointing, he is also critiquing the idea of Enlightenment modernity, and hence Foucault can be termed as a postmodern philosopher. Right? So these are some of the things that we have seen. Anything else do you remember from our previous discussion?
So we also discussed Derrida's idea of Yale hermeneutic mafia. We also discussed
So
that.
the label Yale hermeneutic mafia is not given by Derrida, right? Yale hermeneutic mafia is the label given by critics to the Yale Department of English and Comparative Studies in Yale, who were fascinated by Derrida, and like especially people like Paul Deman, Hillis Miller, and Harold Bloom and Jeffrey Hartman. So these four important scholars drew upon the ideas of Derrida, and that's why they were labeled as Yale hermeneutic mafia by others, because their focus was on extreme analysis of texts, giving priority to rhetoricity of texts. Something that is, by rhetoric you mean figurative and tropological component of language. It was seen as undermining logic as well as grammar. So that was the medieval paradigm of knowledge, which is called trivium of liberal arts. Trivium. So trivium was grammatica, logica, and rhetorica. Grammatica was a discipline which emphasized linguistic study of texts, its grammatical aspects, but also interpretation of texts. It's not to be understood as grammar, Brennan Martin grammar of today. Grammatica as a bigger, larger category of textual analysis. Logic is what we are all aware of, how to argue, how to think systematically, and rhetorica was about persuasion using figurative language. So that was what was taught in Roman Empire and later on in medieval Europe. And Paul Deman talks about how rhetorical component undermines all stable, decidable, fixed meanings that text apparently seems to be giving. So deconstruction is not what you do to the text, but something that you reveal, how text has deconstructed itself, right? It's not a kind of technique. So the examples that Paul Deman later gave, yes. What else do you remember?
Also, sir, we discussed about traditional and individual talent, Harold Bloom. So, and the anxiety of influence. So
Right.
after Milton, so all the authors or all the writers, they suffered from this, and that they have nothing original because they have all had the influences of their predecessors, and that nothing that they write is original.
Yeah. So this whole search for originality and overcoming influence becomes one of the most important crises before any creative talent in the West, and how Harold Bloom reads Western tradition as a struggle for overcoming anxiety of influence. Anxiety of influence comes from strong authors or strong influences like Shelley, like Milton, like Shakespeare, uh, and people are struggling to come out of their influence and write something of their own, right? And that is how he uses the term belatedness to describe modern condition. Belatedness यानी लेट आते हो स्टेज पे, जो आपको कहना है दूसरों ने कह दिया है आपसे बेहतर तरीके से, आपके लिए कुछ कहना रहता ही नहीं है, right? That sense of belatedness becomes the crisis before creative writers.
And then, sir, we also discussed about how this love for their predecessors turns into hate, and the
Correct.
idea of how, and then this leads to an edible an edible conflict that the contemporary writers, they rebel against those writers who influence them.
Right. He's using psychoanalysis in a very unique way, right? And he also uses ideas from Kabbalah, Jewish mystical traditions. Right. What else?
And then we also discussed this idea called revisionary ratio,
Even that,
techniques to evade influence.
correct. And it corresponds to ego defense mechanisms that Freud talks about. Right? Defense mechanisms are things like rationalizations or sublimation or whatever, evasion. So ego tries to protect itself from superego as well as id, right? The seat of instinctual desires, usually incestuous, right? So you can see how psychoanalysis is adapted and put to some different use by Harold Bloom, which does not conform to Freudian approach at all, right? Because Freudian analysis is a psychoanalysis of author's self as a human being, while Harold Bloom seems to be emphasizing the poet in the poet. That's the phrase he uses, the poet in the poet. So psychoanalysis of the poet in the poet. And he uses the terms like FEB. FEB are the new writers who are struggling with the influence of strong precursors, predecessors. Did we discuss something like Foucault on sexuality?
Yes, sir. We discussed that just like madness,
Yeah,
the
it's
idea of
also
gender and sexuality is also not universal.
Correct.
it's also
And
culture specific.
it's
Exactly.
culture
It is
specific.
specific, historically specific. And in his 3-volume history of sexuality in the West, Foucault analyzes how sexuality has been understood in different ways, and it corresponds to how sexuality becomes inflected by politics of power. And by power, he does not mean power as coming from state or government to people. It is not the top-down model of power that Foucault is talking about. For Foucault, power is embedded in every human act, human relation. It's relational, and it's in specific instances that it reveals itself. Right? For example, when teacher tries to evade a question or silence the student in a different way, and that becomes a specific politic act where power is revealed, which he calls micropolitics, right? As against politics of, say, for example, large politics of electoral politics, for example. But for Foucault, power is not so much about state. It's not a statist notion of power, but power as something that is function of, or it is something that is embedded into human actions and thoughts, right? Again, taking off from Nietzsche's idea of will to power, where everybody has will to power. So what Foucault seems to be pointing at is that power is not merely to be traced within class conflict as Marxists would have it, right? And it is to be sought in specific instances of speaking, writing, thinking, talking, doing something. And this is his micropolitics of power. And using Nietzsche, he overturns the idea that power is about suppression, right? Idea that power is suppressive belongs to the traditional thought about power. Power is something that tells you no. That is the traditional understanding of power. Like, say, for example, parents who say, no, you don't go out, you come back before 7 o'clock, right? So power was seen as traditionally prohibitive. But Nietzsche talks about power as a positive force. And what do you mean by positive is that it produces certain kinds of discourses. And discourse is the term that is critical to Foucault. By discourse, he means any act of communication which is intertwined with power, right? So power knowledge nexus, that's the term he uses, that any claim of truth, right, comes from will to power. And it may not be philosophical, metaphysical truths, but truths like मैंने उसको कल देखा था इसके साथ, right? This is also a discourse, and it also has a political dimension to it, right? So language, discourse means all linguistic verbal practices specific which cannot be separated from power, the questions of power, right? And so the discourse on madness in 18th century onwards was in that sense a political one which constructed madness in certain way. So madness is seen not just as something which exists out there independently of discourses about it, but madness is seen as something that is constructed by these discourses, scientific discourses, philosophical discourses, everyday conversations about madness. These discourses produce an object called madness. And same thing can be extended to sexuality, that sexuality is not seen as situated in human desire as Freud would have it, but seen as something that is constructed through discourses. By this, he means that understanding or knowledge of sexuality that was circulating in forms of discourses in 17th century, right, constructed sexuality as a phenomenon, right? So sexuality is not seen as a natural expression of human nature, but a discursive construct, very much like author, right? It's a construct produced through conversations and writings and texts, and even peripheral texts like pornographic writings, like yellow magazines and whatnot, right? So by discourse, he means all these things. So sexuality in Shakespeare's time would be very different phenomena from sexuality in Victorian times, say for example, right? And Foucault seeks to overturn the general understanding of Victorianism. According to Freud, Victorian culture was a suppressive culture or repressive hypothesis that power functioned to suppress sexual desires. Right? Social power was all about preventing or saying no to desire. Right? Hiding desire, concealing desire. That's what Victorian society was all about, and Indian middle class, if you can see, has absorbed many of the qualities of Victorian society because of colonial exposure to colonial rule. Foucault supports this idea. He says that power in Victorian times was operating under a different paradigm of power, and it produces new forms of sexualities rather than saying no. Sexuality was seen as a pathological or expression of human animal desire, was seen as more as in a certain way that can be studied. He talks about how masturbation becomes very important object of scientific research in Victorian society. And a category called homosexual is invented. And Foucault's ideas have a profound influence on queer theory as well. In fact, queer theory, as we know, is derived almost from Foucault in many ways, owes itself to Foucault's ideas of homosexuality, where he's arguing that homosexual as an identity was a product of certain discourses in 19th century. That doesn't mean homosexual activities did not exist before, right? They were considered as sodomy or whatever, all kinds of behavior, a range of behavior and practices. But now it becomes a kind of identity. It becomes an object of research, right? So according to Foucault, the identity is a product of discourses around it. It's seen as a pathological condition, right? Like madness. While in Greek times, homosexuality was not considered as a pathological deviation, abnormal pathological deviation. In fact, homosexuality was far more, was not seen as the other of heterosexuality in Greek times, right? In fact, and that is what whole queer theory is built around. Queer theory argues that the whole binary between heterosexual and homosexual is an artificial one, right? An asymmetrical one, as Derrida would point out. Binaries are always asymmetrical, where one is seen as natural. For example, heterosexuality is seen as natural and self-present, while homosexuality is seen as something that is lack of heterosexuality, right? But if you look at binaristic structures, then what is heterosexuality can only be understood with the reference to homosexuality. Does it make any sense, this deconstruction of heterosexuality? And heterosexuality itself is a construct which is dependent on something outside of itself for its own categorization, right? So these are the politics of sexual orientation. So queer theory tries to overcome this binary by pointing out that there is a kind of range of sexuality is far more fluid and unstable than simplistic homosexual heterosexual binary, right? So it includes even those behaviors which are considered heterosexual, right? So a person who is heterosexual may also exhibit queer characteristics. So queer is a larger category that was formed to overcome this binary, and it owes something to post-structuralist deconstruction in Derrida. It owes something to Foucault, who talks about the identities as politically constructed through discourse of knowledge power. Masturbation becomes a problem of Victorian society. उससे पहले it never existed as a problem, right? And Foucault goes to great lengths to demonstrate how power produces categories like homosexual or heterosexual or masturbation or whatever, or madness or what. So you can see that Foucault's analysis is one of the most influential analysis in the later half of 20th century. And while Derrida is drawing upon Heidegger, Foucault is drawing substantially upon Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, for his theorizations. And Foucault also influenced post-colonialism in many ways, especially by Edward Said. You have heard of Edward Said, right?
Yes, sir. Yes.
So what are his arguments? Said's arguments?
On sexuality?
No. How is he using Foucault? Or what are his ideas about Orientalism? You've heard of that, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We've heard of it.
Anyone remembers? Shika, Pankti, Kushi, Tatsamritti.
Sir, that the Westerners, they think of the East, say the Asians or the people of the East as say ancient or Orient, and
exotic. The whole point, I think, was about how they turned the Eastern and the people of the East as exotic people, and they wrote their history for them in a way. So Edward Said's book was about that, about how the history that was written of the people was one that was very westernized and had concepts that showed the people as exotic, or like how books presented them as fantastical exotic creatures of faraway lands and all.
Right. So Orient is produced as a historical category, right? And East is a business, as was said. So how is it related to Foucault? Can anyone tell me? You've heard of Foucault's ideas from me just now, right? So can you see a relation between Edward Said and Foucault?
sir, can we say that there is again a binary between say historical and ahistorical?
Okay.
That we say if we are the Indians, we are the we are the Asians, so we are the Orient because we are not modern, and we are not, or we don't live in the West, or we aren't as uh, as developed as the Western countries are,
Right.
and they are modern, and they are developed because they are not like us. So a relation between
Right.
they
Yeah,
So
the
this,
other,
yes.
the
this
other,
binarism, also called Manichaeism by some people. Manichaeanism.
Mannequins, yeah.
Right. What else can you find? You are right. Riddhi is right. But more direct application of Foucault is found in Edward Said. In fact, Edward Said applies Foucault. Is application of Foucauldianism. What are some of the key ideas in Foucault? Anyone remembers? Can you relate his idea of power knowledge
Yes, sir.
relating
Exactly.
with Orientalism?
Sir, so can we say that the Westerners, they had power over, I'm so sorry, over us, the Orients, and
In
that
what
they,
power?
sorry,
Yeah,
sir,
yeah. Go ahead, go ahead.
and also that when they came here, they thought that educating these people and giving them the kind of say knowledge that we this is our mission, and that is something that we are doing to help them. So the idea of say studying madness, that can be applied here, that we're studying madness to help those people, but
Okay.
we know that that is not the case. We are doing it because we want to dominate them, and that we want to hold a sort of power over them.
Correct. And Foucault also points out that power is productive, right? It produces discourses, it produces identities, right? Through discourses. So, who is an Indian or Oriental is produced through a discourse that is produced by non-Oriental, the Occidentals, right? So this discourse produces Indians in some way, and how does it do it? Through disciplinary study of Orient. So the whole project of studying the East was not about emancipatory idea of freeing knowledge or knowledge as freedom, as Kant or Hegel would point out, or rationality as an exercise for human welfare, right? That is the modern interpretation given for science. Now, Orientalism implied that you are studying, say, for example, Grierson studied all languages in India, and William Jones studied Dharma Shastras, right? So that he can come up with a code of law for Hindus, and he selected Manusmriti for that. And people are studying various spiritual and discourses in India. Now, somebody may say this is a kind of noble activity, and as Riddhi was pointing out, for welfare of these people as well as you are kind of increasing knowledge, which is a good thing. So knowledge as inherently a good thing is a very enlightenment modern idea. But what is being actually done is that people are, once you start defining, researching someone, you know how to control it, contain it, right? One of the reasons why you want to study yourself is because you want to have control over your life. ऐसे हो सकता है?
Yes, sir, agree.
So the whole noble idea of understand thyself is a political idea. How does that sound? खुद को समझो, खुद के बारे में ज्ञान बढ़ाओ. क्यों? क्योंकि आपको खुद से डर लगता है, कंट्रोल करना चाहते हो अपनी लाइफ. सो समझने की जो इच्छा है ना, वो पॉलिटिकल है, अकॉर्डिंग टू नीचे एंड फूको. So
But
the
sir,
whole,
at some point of level, we have to understand ourselves.
but why? What will happen if you don't understand?
Then sir, how can we how can we decide like what we want to do like in
Ah,
future?
so what are the specific things that you want to thinking of doing in the future? Specific example,
So if
if
I
you
give,
understand yourself, yeah, that this is what you will do in future. What?
so like sir, my point is, at some point, just a second, sir. So can we take example of capacity?
Hmm?
Capacity, like
Uh,
if suppose if I want to be an actor, okay, but I know what's my capacity is, how much struggle I can do. So if I want to understand all this thing, then first of all I have to understand myself that okay, how much capacity I have, then I can go for that.
because if you don't understand it and you become an actor, तो क्या होगा? सोचने से भी डर लगता है ना? Fear of failure,
Yes sir, it's
right? So you want to overcome your fear of failure, and that's why you want to have knowledge about yourself. So source of knowledge is not self-liberation or uh, mukti, but desire to control your future, avoid failures, right? So whole great Socratic injunction, know thyself, according to Nietzsche, is a stupid advice. It's a
then
bad idea.
is it true or not? Like, is it correct if
Nietzsche
we
says it's
think about
bad idea.
ourselves?
Nietzsche says it's a bad idea. It's good thing that Socrates was given poison. उसको मार डालना जरूरी था. ऐसा नीचे कह रहा है. Because it produced, according to him, herd instinct rather than power and mastery. Right. So the whole desire to understand yourself does not come from the place of nobility and grandeur and romanticization, but nervousness and fear and feeling of lack of control over your future. हाँ या ना? कहाँ से आ रहा है ये desire to know yourself? किस जगह से आ रहा है? मैं उसकी बात कर रहा हूँ. वो बहुत महान जगह नहीं है, ऐसे मैं कह रहा हूँ. डर की जगह है. So the whole romanticization of know thyself that comes from Socrates is a political. So Nietzsche exposes the politics of that, and Foucault would take this onwards into an analysis of modern power, something which he calls biopolitics and governmentality. By governmentality, what he means is that in older times, in times of maybe monarchy, as in Elizabethan times, uh, the king and the sovereign had power over person's death. Right? So king could decide who can be killed and who cannot be killed. But with the rise of modern democracy, the power was displaced from the king as a center and started operating on people's lives. So your body became the locus of power. Your life in human body became locus of power, in the sense that you became a number, a statistic. So you register yourself online for vaccine, तो एक number हुआ, right? So you individual कोई बचा है ही नहीं, मगर population जैसी एक category आ जाती है. Population. So पॉपुलेशन को कैसे कंट्रोल किया जाए, पॉपुलेशन को कैसे वैक्सीनेशन दिया जाए, पॉपुलेशन को कैसे पैंडेमिक से बचाया जाए, दैट इज हाउ पावर स्टार्टेड ऑपरेटिंग. सो पावर ओवर डेथ वाज displaced onto power over life, and this is what he means by biopolitics. So family planning, say for example, and very often people started planning their own families. In the sense that people started governing themselves, right? So you wear mask on your own. Nobody tells you to wear that mask, right? People started governing themselves. So this is a very different mode in which power operates in society in modern times. And this is what he calls biopolitics and governmentality. Means the whole focus is on now governance of population. पावर कैसे काम करती है, पॉपुलेशन को गवर्न करती. पहले कैसे काम करती थी, इस आदमी को फांसी सूली चढ़ा दो, उसको जेल में डाल. इट हैड पावर ओवर डेथ, बट पावर स्टार्ट operating anonymously almost. It is no longer situated in a king, it is situated in peoples themselves, right? You discipline yourself, and discipline is one of the important ideas in Foucault, because discipline was seen as a good thing, and discipline has several kind of meanings. One is discipline as discipline of English studies or discipline of biology or psychology, and discipline also means खुद को discipline करना, right? So the whole business of disciplining oneself is also political, right? And that is how power operates anonymously, producing new categories of discourses, new identities, new formations. So power is not seen as something that tells you not to have casual sex, right? Power is something that gets you vaccinated for HIV. I hope you understand. It has changed its mode of functioning, right? And these are some of the radical ideas that you find in Foucault. Anything that you have to say about this?
So I just think that his idea can be pretty much applied to any discipline.
Right. The word discipline has political dimension now. Any discipline.
So even not just discipline, in every act that we do. So say starting an NGO, why are you doing it? There is again some sort of power politics attached to it as well.
Right. हमको ऐसा लग रहा है कि हमारे पास एजेंसी है, हमारे पास चॉइस है, right? We are doing something, but actually it is subtle functioning of power that is circulating in the society, right? So in that sense, Foucault's ideas are postmodern. Why? Because they critique the idea that rationality is inherently liberating, that there is something like progress happening, that there is something like humanism at work, right? For example, people who produce vaccines may say that, we are being humanistic, right? But it has more to do with profits, right? Whole pharmaceutical industry works for profit rather than for welfare of society, right? So, and they have their very insidious ways of, and whenever it functions for profit, it is called capitalism, right? So pharmaceutical capitalism is something that masquerades as, what shall I say, humane endeavor, So Foucault and Derrida can be thought of as uh, postmodernist philosophers, and that's where we need to look at the whole discussion on modernity and postmodernity. And most of what I'm going to say now will be revision of what we have already said, because the question of modernity was also something that we touched upon but could not discuss, right, several times. And I asked you whether what is modernity for us as Indians? Is it westernization, or is it what? What does modernity mean for you and me?
Yeah, I think I mean, as Riddhi, I think said earlier about how, like there's a certain binary that has been formed. Like for us, whatever the West does, or basically European countries, everywhere outside India, whatever people do, it becomes more modern for us. But like I feel now, obviously times have changed a little. For us, modernity also exists in thought and opening our mindsets or expanding horizons. I think it is no longer limited to a set of behaviors or practices. I think
Right.
we're like now also diving into expanding horizons of our mind rather than just behaviors. So I
So,
think that is
what do you
one
mean?
aspect of
What do
modernity
you
that has
mean
come
by
into.
opening up of mind and expanding of horizons, and what has caused it?
So, I okay. So by that I mean like, so one second. Huh. So I sorry. What I mean by that is that we talk, like suppose that so I'm sorry, my nephew is a little. Yeah. So by that I mean, suppose if you're even talking about the queer theory or feminism or any of the topics or sexuality or gender being a social construct, these topics would not have received the kind of response they do today. Because I mean, people call it being woke, but like with the current generation or like even Gen X, Y, Z, whatever, everybody started opening up a little and uh, getting that space to talk about it. So, I mean, that is what I feel that our generation has a much more open mindset to discuss all of this. So, that is what I mean by, like the opening of mindsets and expanding horizons is like we're no longer limited to, like I'm sitting in Gujarat, I'm not just learning about that place. There are other countries, there are other fields. Like even if I am studying literature, that does not really limit me anymore to not learn something about design or learn something about what an engineering student does. So not just education, but any field. I feel like we're expanding into newer horizons, and there are the limits and the lines that used to exist, however faint or not faint, they're slowly dissipating, I think, and we're all like getting more into each other's fields day by day. So I think it's like very, that's what I feel is
Yeah.
happening.
So, what you mean by opening up is becoming more liberal and tolerant towards things like sexuality, gender,
Yes.
and what else? The questions of power, for example,
Yeah,
and
power, democracy, everything and
democracy
anything under the sun, basically.
under the
Now we
sun.
can question anything.
Earlier we were
Yeah.
close to it, and now we are open.
Yeah. Yes.
And second thing that you thought was about various fields. You know more about other fields, and you also know about other cultures and other
Yes.
societies. So in that sense, your horizons are expanding, and these are the features of modernity, right? And what
Yes.
has caused it?
What has caused it? I access to information, maybe.
Access to information. Okay, knowledge, that is.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Greater access is because of
Technology and yeah, I mean
technology
travel, everything.
and
I mean traveling and the
travel.
whole
Mhm.
shebang.
right? So, what do you mean by modernity? Do you mean this opening up of minds and opening up of horizons brought about by technology and traveling and other things as
Yeah,
modernity?
I mean, if we're not limiting ourselves to the binary of the West being more developed, etc., this is what modernity should entail also.
Hmm.
Also.
Also, a belief that West is not more advanced, is it?
Yeah, I mean, so if we're looking into statistics,
मगर ये clear theory आई
there
कहाँ
are
से?
countries who are way more developed in infrastructure and technology.
नहीं
South
नहीं ये
Korea, Japan, they
no, no,
are
Shika, tell me where did this clear
way
theory and
ahead of the
discussion?
United States of America, but people are still constantly not,
No, no, did you get my questions?
either people are not informed underdogs at one point, but
Sir,
now
I
they're
think she
coming
can't
up,
hear
they're
you.
rising, but
Okay.
people,
Others can hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear
when you
you.
have Singapore, you have Japan.
See,
So the
Oh,
see,
huh,
I,
question
sir,
that I am
sorry, I did
putting,
not hear you.
Shikha,
Okay.
no issue, no issue. My question was very simple.
Yeah, I
Where
think
did this idea of queer theory and where did this technology come from? When you travel by aeroplanes. So aeroplane की technology कहाँ से आई? या इंटरनेट की टेक्नोलॉजी कहाँ से आई? या क्वियर थियरी और सेक्सुअलिटी के बारे में फ्रॉइड और सब के आइडियाज कहाँ से आए? Foucault.
when we talk about internet and that thing, so it was come from like it was came from Western countries.
And aeroplane technology?
Same, sir. It was
that is
come
also
from
from the West, the
Western,
Wright
sir.
brothers.
And queer theory?
Yeah, theory, like
So the theory given by Foucault that has come from West, but I think India also has its own uh, history, like his queer history. It's just that it has not uh, is not widely known, and
That
that
very fact that you discover queer theory or queer in Indian history is something that you are doing after being exposed to the idea of queer.
yes, sir, yes.
So you are discovering yourself afresh. You are looking back at your own history and say, oh, this is यहाँ पे queer था, ये शिखंडी है ना, ये queer था, ये फिर आगे जाके ये जो मोहिनी है जो विष्णु ने रूप धारण किया वो भी queer है. And then you go on, you rethink about your own past and yourself after being exposed to a Western idea of queer, right? So your understanding of past is changed because of your exposure to the Western notion of sexuality and queer and liberal ideas of sexuality. But these liberal ideas themselves were there in India, or they came from the West?
So the liberal idea of homosexuality and queer, and you mean that?
Hmm? Or any liberal ideas of democracy?
Sir, I think they did come from the West. And like you said, they came from the West. We discovered our history. And that is when we knew that, oh, this was already here, but we were not
So
aware.
one thing is definitely clear, that our encounter with the Western society is critical to our modernity.
Yes.
Very important. And when we mean modernity, as you rightly pointed out, also rethinking your own past and who you are, right? So, because West and Western modernity itself is critical to Indian modernity, we may not be derivative, right? It is not blind mimicry of the West that I'm talking about, but I'm talking about this exposure. right? So because of this deep exposure to Western society and culture after 19th century, Western education became part of Indian society and Western. We have to understand Western modernity, modernism, postmodernity, and postmodernism in great detail, because our own modernity, our own understanding of ourselves depends on how well we understand Western modernity. Agree? Disagree? Because this exposure is critical from past almost, what should I say, 200 साल 200 साल से हम वेस्ट के बहुत क्लोज एनकाउंटर में हैं, right? So let's quickly now take a look at the questions of modernity and postmodernity, modernism and postmodernism in the West, right? So this is the rationale why we are doing it, because it's critical to our self-understanding. Anything you have to say, Riddhi?
No, sir, I agree with what you said, the close connection that we have with.
Okay, okay. Okay, so how did modernity emerge in the West? And the story goes something like this, right? There was a period called early modern in the West. That itself is a debatable term, but we are using it anyway. And it begins with what is often called Renaissance. In the 16th century onwards, 15th century onwards, in the West, we are told that this is the beginning of modernity in the West. It is called early modernity. And the reason why it is so is because the feudal structure, which existed for how many years? Almost 1000 years in the West, one whole millennium, was deeply feudal. And by feudal, you mean it's an economic social system based on agriculture rather than trade. And it is based on hierarchic arrangement of power. That at the top is the king, and there are several sardars, knights, dukes, esquires, and others, right to the bottom where there is a peasant who works in the field. So labor of the peasant produces surplus agricultural output, which is then used up by the system right up to top. This is feudal system. And it came into existence after the collapse of Roman Empire in the 4th century. So Roman Empire was largely based on trade. Trade was central to Roman Empire. And as Roman Empire collapsed due to the attacks by Goths and Vandals, among others, the Germanic tribes, as they are called, it collapsed, giving rise to feudal system. And it also saw consolidation of Roman Catholic Church under Holy Roman Empire, not to be confused with the older Roman Empire of King Sharma Glane. I don't know how to pronounce his name. And Holy Roman Empire codified and structured and created Roman Catholicism, the institution of Christianity, with Pope at its top. And Pope and King were almost working together to control the whole region. So Christianity and King, right, Pope and King, worked hand in glove to establish their power. And King had to depend upon Pope for legitimacy, and Pope would depend obviously on King for funds and muscle power. This arrangement also started becoming more and more corrupt by the time you came to 14th century. So with collapse of feudalism, we see two important things happening. One is there is an upwardly mobile section of the society, right? Feudalism says that peasant can never become a duke and duke can never become a king, right? It's hereditary. But now there is a section of society which now believes that it can move upward in society by sheer wealth, accumulation of wealth. So more money you have, greater status in society you will have. So this section of society the new middle class or the class had a new set of values, and this is the emergence of modernity. This section believed that the other life is not important, as Roman Catholicism and feudal system would tell you. Feudal system said that life after is more important, and life here is preparation for life after in Christianity. But this new section says that life here, that is secular life, is more important than the life after death. And remember, this is Christianity. They don't believe in rebirth, right? We believe in rebirth. So this life is more important. So certain materialism and capitalism seems to emerge. And you see a kind of rebirth of trade in form of mercantile capitalism. And the best example is Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama, and later on East India Society, East India Company that came to India. These are mercantile capitalist ventures. So a lot of wealth did they gather, and it flowed into European society. So what Shikha was talking about, opening up of mental horizons, happened because these people traveled all over the world. Right? They discovered that Europe is not the only place in the world. There is Africa, there is India, and most of these countries were even richer than them. Right? Emperor Jahangir was far, far more richer than Britain. Right? These were extremely rich, big empires. Chinese empire was huge, right? And it almost ruled over the seas. And due to some reason, they discontinued their navy, and British Navy almost replaced Chinese Navy. Otherwise, we would be ruled over by China today, right? So all these events opened up people's minds, and that's why it's called the Renaissance. And this new section of society started studying Greek and Latin texts once again. Earlier, Greek and Latin texts, Aristotle, Horace, and Virgil and Plato, would be studied only by priests and those who are part of, what shall I say, the religious part, the clergy, right? And college was also meant for clergies. Oxford and Cambridge universities was meant to teach people who would later teach in convents. It was not open for you and me, right? This changed. So people started learning Plato and Aristotle again. And that's why it was called rebirth of classical learning. And that is how Renaissance happened. Now, all this is well known, right, to all of you. ये सब पढ़ा ही हुआ है ना, कुछ नया मैंने कहा क्या? कुछ नया नहीं कहा. बट मैंने नया क्या कहा, मैंने उसे मॉडर्निटी के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में देख रहे हैं हम, right, from the perspective of modernity, that materialism, capitalism seems to be born at this juncture. Broadening of horizons seems to be happening. New sorts of knowledge is produced by the society. There are inventions like printing press, which would make text available to everybody. और पहले प्लेटो को पढ़ना है तो आपके पास बहुत सारे पैसे होने चाहिए, तो ये आप कॉपी करके ला सकते हो, right, writing करके. But now you can produce it in thousands. So Gutenberg used technology from China to produce a movable type of printing press. Right? चाइना से आया हुआ है, सबसे इम्पोर्टेंट मॉडर्निटी का साधन ईस्ट से आया हुआ है, राइट? पेपर भी ईस्ट से आया हुआ है. So the Gutenbergian revolution happens and it changes the value system, right? So this class now is a literate class and relies a lot on printing technology for knowledge. And it produces a certain space of communication where two people do not meet each other, right? And still there is communication happening. A person in Wales may talk to a person in London without meeting, through newspapers in the space of printing. तो उसे हम print sphere कह सकते हैं, but it is also public sphere in the sense that people discussed the actions taken by government, policy related things, ethics and morality, literature, criticism, ये सब print sphere में पैदा होता है. And you have new patronage for books in form of this new middle class, right? According to some scholars like Benedict Anderson, this creates a possibility of imagining nation state, because an Irish person in Dublin can talk with a person in London, right? They can talk about England without actually meeting each other. So Benedict Anderson uses the term nation as an imagined community, which is produced by print capitalism. Here is a new community. पहले कैसे community थी जो face to face थी. Whoever was talking could see each other and discuss. But now you can have communication without meeting each other. And that is the condition for production of something called nation state. So nation state is a modern idea, right? It's not an eternal idea. When we talk of Bharat Varsh or Aryavrat, we are not talking of nation state. We are talking of cultural civilizational space, geographical territory. Nation state assumes a unified identity, political identity. वेल्स वाला बंदा और आयरलैंड वाला बंदा और लंदन वाला बंदा सब सोचते हैं कि हम इंग्लिश है, right? And there would be an apparatus called state which keeps everything together. So nation state is a modern idea, right? And it is produced by print capitalism, by this new middle capitalist class, whose values are materialism, secularism, which means this life, this world is more important than that world, and separation of church and state, right? And the most important idea is rationality. So reason se produce hota hai government, rather than earlier kings were seen as representation of divine on earth, but now you see that we are governing ourselves through print space, right? So new identities are produced by technology, and new polity is formed by technology, that is nation state. Now these are the core ideas of modernity. That your status is not based on your birth, but on your wealth. And wealth can be produced through hard work and pragmatic attitude to life, right? Yates पढ़ने से आपको कौन से पैसे मिलने वाले हैं, right? Utilitarianism and so on and so forth. And liberalism is also produced by rationality, reasoning. Humanism is also a value, and we discussed how theocentric universe ideology of theocentrism was replaced by anthropocentrism or humanism in the Renaissance. So after Renaissance, another phase of consolidation of modernity is called Enlightenment. And the core principle of Enlightenment is rationality, progress, humanism. And one of the best examples of that is Immanuel Kant. And what Immanuel Kant does, a German philosopher, was he wrote an essay called What is Enlightenment? Answering the question, what is enlightenment? And he defines enlightenment as ability to reason for yourself, right? Using reason for yourself. So earlier you used to base your life on authority of religion. Acha kya hai, bura kya hai was told to you by religion, was told to you by your parents and elders, your peers or priests. But now you started thinking rationally, acha kya hai aur bura kya hai. And that, according to him, is a sign of maturity. And this maturity is enlightenment. Right? So enlightenment, according to Kant, is when you live your life based on your own rationality rather than what the authorities tell you. Right? And this is the new value of the new class that we have just discussed. So it is closely connected with the rise of capitalism in the West, right? And Kant wrote important books like Critique of Pure Reason, where he tried to understand what is made possible by reason, what are limitations of reason. Second book was Critique of Practical Reason, which was on ethics. And he says that what is good, what is bad, what is right, what is wrong, can you base it on rationality, individual reasoning, rather than somebody telling you, a religious book, Gita, Quran, Bible, or a priest, Padri, Mullah, Brahmin, whoever, or your parents or your elders telling you what is good or bad. And he comes up with the idea of categorical imperative. Very interesting idea. Imperative means a rule, categorical means universal. So if you say doing drugs is okay, right, or having casual sex is fine, can you make it into a universal rule applicable to all? Your parents, your children, your siblings, everybody. Do they have freedom to do drugs, have casual sex? If the answer is yes, then that is good. But if you say it's only good for me, then it is not categorical imperative and hence not moral. Right? So he is trying to base ethics on rationality. Now, this is also very important. He trifurcates knowledge into ethics, philosophy and science को एक ही discourse मान सकते हैं, और तीसरा aesthetics. So aesthetics is considered autonomous from ethics or science, right? And this is very important development in West. And that's why you can see that today science, arts or philosophy सब अलग हो गया है. Science, commerce, arts, right? So knowledge is trifurcated and arts is seen as autonomous, having its own internal rationality.
Sir? Excuse me, sir. Can you please repeat what you said right now, that he trifurcates knowledge into, can you repeat those three categories?
Yeah.
One is aesthetics.
Category is philosophy or science. उसके लिए science and philosophy are almost one. Okay. Second is ethics. Right. And third is aesthetics. Critique of judgment. And aesthetics is to be understood as independent of ethics. That art does not have any ethical purpose. Art has its own purpose to be itself. That is what we mean by autonomy of art. Right? When you watch Taj Mahal, you don't ask what is the use of Taj Mahal. उससे क्या फायदा होगा? ताजमहल, तो ताजमहल बना रहे हो, इससे किसका फायदा हो रहा है? किसी का फायदा नहीं हो रहा है, right? It is useless. So art does not have any other purpose apart from being art. That is what Kant is talking about. It is purposiveness without purpose. So aesthetic domain becomes independent from political and ethical domains. And that is what we mean by autonomy of art. And this is the core idea of enlightenment. Right? So let us very quickly revise these ideas. One is rationality as resulting in freedom. Means when people were very 1,000 years ago, nobody was free. That is what Hegel would say 2,000 years ago. Then you had monarchy where one person was free. But in democracy, everybody is free in theory. Right? In practice, it's different, all of us know. But in theory, everybody is equal. And that has happened because of development of reason. And that is what Shikha was saying, that now we are more open-minded and liberal because of rationality, reason. Because we reason, right? We think rationally, we have become reason. We have become liberal and our horizons have expanded. Now that is the theory which Hegel and Kant are promoting. Right? So liberal humanism is core principle of Enlightenment modernity. Science and rationality are seen as inherently progressive compared to other less progressed countries like India, Africa, China. And Marx uses the term called Oriental despotism to define that there is no such thing like democracy in other places. So far with me, Enlightenment. And Enlightenment philosophy was translated into political practice when in French Revolution. And French Revolution was based on the idea of equality, liberty, and fraternity. And the new class that we have been talking about rebelled against the aristocratic class, the clergy, and monarchy in French Revolution, right? So this fourth class was called the fourth estate. First estate is monarchy, second estate is aristocracy, and the third estate is clergy. This is the fourth estate, the middle class, right? They rebelled against the king and aristocrats and clergymen and founded, at least in theory, modern democracy. Right? Politically, this new entity in France did not survive for long, but it created a possibility of democracy. And you can see that even Indian Constitution enshrines these core principles of French Revolution, Enlightenment modernity as it is practiced. Right? So political practice of Enlightenment is found in French Revolution. In economic domain, modernity expressed itself as industrial revolution, and that transformed the whole world from being agricultural dominated economy to industrialized capitalism. Right? Parliamentary democracy became the polity of capitalism, and nationalism became the ideology of capitalism. So we have come to the end of the 18th century, and 19th century saw this expanding, all these things, so that by the end of 19th century and beginning of 20th century, you have this at its pinnacle. Right? It's a pinnacle of modernity. Right? in Victorian period onwards. It's heavily industrialized society. It is colonial society. It is extremely rich society. That is where we have reached. And in literary criticism, we have already discussed early modernity में Sir Philip Sidney आते हैं. Then neoclassical period जो enlightenment से जुड़ा है, उसमें Dryden, Pope, Johnson आते हैं. And industrial revolution और French revolution के बाद romanticism आता है. Now Wordsworth, Byron, Keats, Shelley, and philosophers like Kant and Hegel. Right. So by the time you come to the end of 19th century, this has become a full-fledged capitalist Western society whose core ideal is nationalism. Now, in the beginning of 20th century, you have World War I, which undermines Kant's great philosophical belief that the whole world will have a single form of government called world government, and it will be cosmopolitan world. That's what Kant had dreamt of. Ek dunya hogi, ek sarkar hogi. Right? Instead of that, you have several countries trying to kill each other, destroy each other, rob each other, plunder each other. In World War I, which resulted in massive destruction of humanity and economy. And there is a gradual disillusionment that it causes, which brings about something called modernism. So here is the distinction between modernity and modernism. Modernity begins in Renaissance, right? Modernism begins when modernity is in crisis, when it is being, people are slowly losing faith in modernity. And modernism is an artistic cultural movement associated with Eliot, Ezra Pound, Wallace Stevens, William Carlos Williams, and you've heard of them, right? W.B. Yeats and others, right? So that is modernism. And modernism and modernity are two different things. This is what you should be clear by now. Right? Modernity is a larger phenomena of development of human thought and society and economy starting from 15th century. Modernism is a 20th century phenomena after World War I. Right? But it is in the domain of arts, culture, and literature. And Wasteland is a typical modernist poem, where he talks about fragmentation and sterility of Western civilization. That instead of love, you have sex. Instead of spirituality, you have materialism. Instead of philosophy, you have commercial outlook. Right? So that is for him a kind of decadence of Western civilization that is expressed through Wasteland and poems like Prufrock and many poems. So T.S. Eliot can be considered as a typical modernist, and he has rejected the neo-romantic poetry of Tennyson and others, Swinburne and Matthew Arnold and Keats and Shelley, and he launches a frontal attack on romanticism as a juvenile development, right? So he turns towards classicism in a different way. So poetry, like Wasteland, does not have any linear discursive construct. It does not have any coherent meaning. It's all about fragmentation. It's like a pastiche. It's like a mural. टुकड़े हैं, टुकड़े इकट्ठा करके उसने पोएम बनाने की कोशिश की है, but it is a failure. And we discussed this when we were discussing, if you remember, Terry Eagleton's essay on uh, Matthew Arnold and T.S. Eliot. Do you remember that? Marxism हम discuss कर रहे थे. Who made a presentation? Shikha, you made? You did?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So, do you remember that discussion about wasteland and Matthew Arnold?
Yeah. Yes.
So, this is modernism and modernity. Anything you have to say so far with me?
Yes, sir.
So, I have rehearsed the history of Western civilization with the question of modernity in center to put it in perspective of modernity. Now, what happens that First World War turns into Second World War, which is far more devastating, destructive, a huge kind of destruction of human life happens. And people now start rethinking, as they did in modernism, about the fundamentals of Western civilization. And the fundamentals were based on the Enlightenment ideas of humanism, of progress, of science, of technology, of rationality. ये सब जो आप मानते थे कि हम बहुत progressive है, were put under doubt. Science and technology, which was meant to be seen as liberating, resulted in atomic bomb and gas chambers, right? And Holocaust, where millions of Jews were gassed and killed by Hitler. Nationalism, which was seen as a sign of Western progress, was seen as leading to hatred for other countries. So everything that the West glorified about itself, saw itself as a pinnacle of humanity, was seen now as leading to this massive destruction of Western society completely. हर घर में एक युवान मर गया होता. At least one dead young man in each family, imagine. And London was completely destroyed, bombed, right? And it was a huge devastation. Between World War, there is also something called Russian Revolution that has happened based on application of Marxist thought. And they destroyed czars and aristocrats and clergy and created the Soviet Union. And Soviet Union applied Marxist principles, and that also became extremely oppressive in form of Stalinism. So people started getting disillusioned with Marxism as well. So by the time you reach 1945, everything that you considered as the core ideas of Western civilization and modernity was put under a scanner. People thought that there must be something wrong with these basic fundamentals of modernity. So it was high time to rethink modernity, and that is the beginning of what is called postmodernity. So postmodernity as a cultural phenomena begins by interrogation of modernity, the core principles of rationalism, progress, of humanism, of science as liberating, nationalism as a sign of being more civilized than tribals, and so on and so forth. So all these basic fundamentals of Western civilization, liberalism, right, were put under a scanner, interrogated, and that is what we mean by postmodernity. Right. So postmodernity can mean several things from now onwards, 1945 onwards. It can mean continuation of some of the ideas of core ideas of modernity. It can mean end of the period when modernity was seen as the best possible ideology and practice, right? And formation of a new kind of ideology. That can be one meaning. Other meaning can be seen as something like post-graduation. That means it's not that you've forgotten everything about modernity, but you are building on top of it. You are trying to take it further. And this is what we discussed when we were discussing post-structuralism. Yaad hai? Post-structuralism continues some of the assumptions of structuralism, like belief in differences. There are no positive terms, right? So postmodernism also seems to continue some of the assumptions, like rationality. Interrogation of rationality also happened rationally. What do you understand by this statement? Reason was also being debated rationally. What do you see? What do you understand by this? Would Khushi, Shikha, Tatsam want to say something? Okay, let's take a specific example, right? For example, Friedrich Nietzsche and his attack on rationality, right? In his very famous essay called On Truth and Lying in Extra-Moral Sense. You can look up this essay on the net. On Truth and Lying in Extra-Moral Sense, ऐसा एक essay है, which was published posthumously after he died, and probably when he was mad, after his madness set in. He is arguing that the very notion that language can reveal truth is misleading, because language is made up of metaphors, metonymies, similes, figures of speech, and also it contains reductions and simplifications. Like, for example, if I talk about a leaf, right? You understand what is leaf. If I tell you leaf is green, then this idea of leaf that is expressed by the word leaf is a very reductive idea, because there are thousands of kinds of leaves of various shades of green. Am I making some sense? If I tell you leaf is green, it is true, right? No.
Yes, sir.
But there can be thousands of shades of green and thousands of kinds of leaves in various seasons. Right? So language cannot capture this complexity of the world, and that's why it is incapable of leading you to truth. Inherently, it is incapable of leading you to truth. So by implication, all religious doctrines which are there in language, right? All philosophies which are also in language are incapable of telling you truth. So neither Bible nor Gita nor Quran nor nothing can actually give you truth, because language itself is incapable of giving you truth. In terms of Indian philosophy, Shabda was considered as Praman, right? Shabda means Ved mein kaha hai to wo sahi hai, satya hai. But Nietzsche is arguing that Shabda cannot be considered as Praman, because it's reductive, it's complex, and it's tropological. That means it's made up of figures of speech. And anthropomorphisms means you imagine God in your own image. So हमारे भगवान हमारे जैसे होते हैं. आप खराब काम करो तो वो आपको सजा देते हैं, अच्छा काम करो तो आपको पैसे देते हैं. I don't know what it is, but our imagining of God is like us, right? It's anthropomorphism. So he is taking a pot shot at everything by putting language under question. If language cannot tell you truth, then nothing is true. Neither religion, nor science, nor philosophy, because they are all in language. Right? So this Nietzsche's attack, then later on some people pointed out that he is saying this in language. Right? Nietzsche could be language में ही कह रहा है ना, कि language is incapable of truth. Am I making some sense?
Yes.
So is Nietzsche saying truth?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm interrupting. Is it the idea that you discussed about Nietzsche? Is it similar or same as Derrida's idea of transcendental signified or
Exactly.
signifier leading to signifier?
So Derrida is taking off from Nietzsche, right? Derrida points out three important moments of deconstruction in his
Okay.
very famous essay Structure, Sign and Play. जिसमें पहला है नीत्शे, दूसरा है फ्रॉइड और तीसरा है हाइडेगर.
These are what? Three what?
Three moments of deconstruction.
Okay.
Right. So Nietzsche seems to be anticipating many ideas of post-structuralism and postmodernism. Right. So similarly, people say reason cannot tell you truth are also using reason. And that is the point by which Derrida attacks Foucault. Foucault says that madness is excluded by bourgeois rationality, Enlightenment thought. Madness is made an object and is marginalized. But then Derrida asked, what is your discourse then? Is it not rational? So are you not continuing marginalizing madness? Can you get Derrida's question?
No, I didn't get it.
Foucault is saying that Western rationality, right, Enlightenment rationality and capitalism marginalized madness, made it into an object, right, and it segregated mad people from the society. It was exclusionary, right, and that is the problem with Enlightenment rationality. ऐसा Foucault कह रहा है. It is exclusive. It is political. It is discriminating. Right? This is Foucault's thesis. Derrida's thesis is you are also operating rationally, aren't you? ये जो तू कह रहा है, Foucault कह रहा है, ये भी rationally है ना? Or is it irrational?
Rational, because he's like actually given it thought and etc.
Yeah. So he is also using rationality and logic. So he is also logocentric in a sense that he is also continuing the same discourse which has marginalized madness. He is perpetuating the same discourse. He is not stepping outside of that discourse of rationality. Is that clearer to you, Ujala? Is it very difficult to understand?
No, it's clear. But how would he step out? Because he's saying that madness is there is no way to step out.
So when you say language is incapable of telling truth, then you are also using language to say that, right? As Nietzsche is trying.
Okay.
Right? And these are called the aporias of modernity. Aporia yani undecidability. And that is what deconstruction results in, aporias, which means both things, but at the same thing, you cannot decide between two positions. And that happens because of self-reflexivity. For example, if I write something like this in a box, that sentence written in this box is false. Let me show you. That's it. Let me see. Now,
Yeah.
sentence written in this box is false, but is it false? If you say it is false, then it is saying truth. And if you say it is saying truth, then it does not.
Understood, sir. Understood, sir. Understood. Yeah.
That is self-reflexivity, which causes aporias. And the idea comes from Kurt Gödel and incompleteness theorem in mathematics. There he says that axioms cannot be proved by the same axioms. It is something like self-consuming sets, as some mathematicians would point out.
It's we can connect this with language of paradox, right?
But remember, very good. But that was in poetry.
That was in poetry, but we can connect it, right?
But then,
But Derrida is saying that all language is paradox.
Okay.
And self-consuming set का example है, एक गांव में एक barber है, right? Who would shave only those people who did not shave themselves. There is only one barber in the village, and he will shave only those people who do not shave themselves. So does he shave himself? Should I repeat the question?
I understood, sir.
In village, there is only one barber, and he shaves only those people who cannot, should not shave themselves. खुद की हजामत वो नहीं करते, उनकी ही वो हजामत करता है, और वो एक ही है, तो वो खुद की हजामत कौन करता है? So this is called self-devouring sets कहते हैं mathematics में. Slightly technical, but these are the origins of deconstruction. And postmodernism is characterized by these kind of aporias of modernity.
In this context, Derrida says that nothing operates outside the text.
Exactly.
That means everything is controlled by language only. You cannot go outside of it.
Right.
In that sense, no?
Again, so much of it would be false. I mean, if we're also putting that on.
So this is
according
critique
to
of
some
Foucault.
Yeah.
Nothing is outside the text, then that means it is critique of Foucault by Derrida.
It is critique of structuralism as well.
Yeah. Okay.
For example, he would say in a very famous essay called Law of Genre by Derrida, he says that the law of genre itself cannot be part of the genre. For example, the law says a sonnet is a poem which has 14 lines. But this statement itself cannot be part of the sonnet. वो sonnet नहीं है. So in some sense, it is outside of the form, the structure, but it also seems to govern that genre. Right? It's paradoxically inside and outside both. The law of genre belongs to the genre, at the same time is outside of it. Am I making some sense when I say the law of sonnet would be something like sonnet should be in 14 lines? और ये जो statement है, proposition है, वो sonnet का नहीं है. यानी वो सोनेट में नहीं आता, 14 लाइन का सोनेट नहीं है, तो वो फॉर्म के बाहर भी है, फिर भी फॉर्म उससे कंट्रोल्ड होता है.
I think you told us a word which is used by Derrida related to this. I don't remember that word. I
It
mean,
is transcendental signified, it is logocentrism.
no,
Logos existing inside
some
and
other
outside.
word.
Yeah, he keeps on coining a range of words
Yeah.
like dissemination, like hymen, like
Yeah, hymen.
yeah, hymen
Correct.
as covering the sexual organs, whether it is inside the body or outside the body. It is undecidable. So undecidability is the characteristic of deconstructive reading. So there are 5 minutes left. Tomorrow I want to continue with the discussion on postmodernism, and then what we will do is the next week you can make, somebody has to make a presentation on the essay by Frederick Jameson on Baudelaire as a postmodern poet, because Baudelaire was largely read as characteristic of modern poet. But according to Frederick Jameson, there are aspects of postmodernity that you can find in Baudelaire. So somebody who has not made a presentation till now,
Amatullah,
So-
Rohit, and
अच्छा,
Manjari.
Amatullah. हाँ sir,
Three
so
are there.
Amatullah,
Yeah.
Rohit,
Huh.
Amatullah, Rohit, and
Manjari.
Manjari.
just Amatullah, AMATULLA. Why is she not attending class? She used to come.
So no idea. We like
Right.
send reminders all the time. So
Okay.
Yeah.
Amatullah, Rohit, and third is
Manjari.
Manjari.
Yeah, right. Manjari.
Manjari. Okay.
So we will tell them about the presentation, but
Yeah.
again, we're not sure if they'll respond or not. So then should
Yeah, but
one
just
of us
inform
also
them.
be ready for preparation for like a presentation or something? Just in
But
case.
so you will inform me in the group if they don't respond, because there are marks for it.
हाँ yes
Presentation.
sir. Yeah.
है ना? तो उनको 0 मिले ऐसे थोड़ा ही चलेगा. Let's
नहीं
have
नहीं हाँ yeah.
And sir, yesterday we just received a mail that this time also they are going to conduct online exam.
online exams.
Yeah.
That is towards the end of April,
No, sir, from
May
20 May to
20th
28th
onwards.
May.
May.
28th
Sir,
May to
should we
28th
send the
May.
timetable to you? I mean,
No, I haven't received the time, but
no,
roughly.
so like, okay.
Should we send you, sir?
Should we send it to you? Like,
Yeah, please do.
I will. I'll put it on the group. So
Fine.
And sir, your paper is on 20th May. The first paper is
28th.
appear only.
okay.
Yeah.
8. 2/8.
20,
20.
28th May.
20th May. Okay. Literary criticism. Okay. So I think we are running out of time. You have a class again coming up, right? At 1?
Yes, sir. We have a minus.
So we meet tomorrow and we look at postmodernism at some length, and we will also take up a concept बचते हैं. New historicism we can take up. A reader response रह गया है ना शायद.
And
Yeah.
sir, when are we going to study Indian aesthetics?
That's the last unit that I have kept. 14.
Okay.
Yeah. So how many things are left? I think I will just check. Reader response रह जाता है, modernism रह जाता है, feminism and gender रह जाता है. Yeah. But we have time on our hands. So
Yeah, we have 1 month.
Yeah, we have 1 month. So. Yeah. So just inform other 3 people about presentation, and if they don't respond, then maybe you will have to take it up. One of you.
Okay.
Right? Okay.
Yes.
So, bye and take care.
Okay.
Have a good
Yes.
day.
And
You
sir,
too,
tomorrow, what are we going to do?
11:30.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll continue postmodernism, right?
and we'll take up the chapters which are left.
Okay. Okay.
New historicism ले सकते हैं.
Sure, sir. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you,
Thank you,
sir.
sir. Bye, sir.
Yeah, bye.
Have a good day.
Yeah, and Tatsam, please post the videos also.
Yes, I'll do.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Bye.